Hello, Mr. English teacher. Are you coming out now? Have you been marking any more essays again? I heard that Year 12 needs some help on their poems. How are your pupils? Are they studying hard? Oh dear, I suppose you need to make them another film then. Bye-bye, Mr. English teacher.
Hi guys, I know you're looking for some guidance as to how to write a poetry essay. So I'm going to start by telling you the selection of things which you can choose from when you're assembling a poetry essay. Before we start, I'd like to address one of the things that's very challenging about essay writing, which is the fact that it seems as though you're filling a blank canvas. The main purpose of what I'm setting out to do in this film is really to show you how you can block it out to make it look more like a painting by numbers exercise. Before we do that, I'd like to just remind you of the things you're expected to achieve in a poetry essay. There are three main things you need to achieve to get the grades. Perhaps the most obvious one is to answer the question that appears on the exam paper. Now, the question should be written in a way that meets the assessment criteria for the exam, but you do need to remember that assessment criteria. It'll appear on the exam paper, so you shouldn't have too much trouble making sure your essay matches. The thing which sometimes people forget is the fact that a good essay is actually supposed to be quite an impressive thing. Now, to get a B or an A, in my book, you have to be original, you have to say interesting things. And you won't do that unless you yourself are interested in the topic you're writing about. You really need to try and find something that gets your intellectual enthusiasm going, if you like. To achieve the three things I've just set out, it is necessary to write a plan. What I'm going to go through for you now are the things that you have to choose from when you're planning an essay. Theme is always significant. Whether or not you choose to set it out as a separate paragraph is debatable. It's probably best to refer to it as you go through. Theme is the intellectual aspect of the poem. Tone is the emotional dimension. Both of those are things that you can come back to time and time again throughout the whole essay. Form is more important in some essays than others. If you're writing about a sonnet, I hope that you would choose to mention the fact that there is an octet and a sestet, and that there's a shift in the poet's meaning as he goes from the 8th to the 9th lines. Closely linked to the idea of form is the idea of structure. If you were writing a poem about a race, you could start by writing about the end of the race and work your way back to the beginning, if you wanted to. The idea of voice is very important. If you remember when we studied the poem My Last Duchess, the whole thing was delivered through a kind of a role which the poet assumed for the duration of the poem. It wasn't a sincere expression of an emotion by the poet. It wasn't his experience. Rhyme, rhythm and metre are very challenging, and I will come back to those in later presentations. Luckily, you don't need to write about all of them every time. Imagery you do need to write about. Most poems contain some imagery, and it is one of the easier topics to deal with. Start with simile and metaphor and work your way through. Diction, very important. Have there been sort of characteristic word choices made by the poet? When you're writing about the idea of lines in poetry, use words like enjambement, end-stop lines and caesuras. Any aspect of language is worth commenting on. Punctuation, sentence formation, these are really important. Also be on the lookout for frequent letter sounds, harsh K's or soft M's. Okay, moving on, it's just to remind you, you have a choice about which of these things you need to write about. Remember, not every poet uses every trick in every poem. It's up to you to take control of the situation and decide which ideas you want to work with and which ideas are most important. For example, imagery. Some poems are just very direct. They're not necessarily descriptive. They might just be expressing an idea without trying to shape it into some sort of elaborate metaphor. So you could choose a poem that doesn't have a lot of imagery in it. On the other hand, you might find that you're working with a poem that has no rhyme in it. So just because you have that as a sort of category or subheading in your mental template doesn't mean to say you have to say things like there is no rhyme in this poem. That's not necessary. So not every poem is going to be rhyming, not every poem is going to have large amounts of imagery in it. And the same goes for metre. If you're choosing poems from the modern sections of the anthology, there's a very good chance that they won't be metrical verse, but they'll be free verse. So although it looks as though there are a hell of a lot of categories in this potential list of ingredients you might choose from, you don't need them all every time. But you do need to be aware of which ones are there. Sometimes the comparison between the two poems you're writing about will simply be to say that one has an aspect that another doesn't. So all you have to do are these things. If you manage to do all of these things, then you'll pass. It's easy, really. In the next film that I'll be putting on this site, you'll be able to learn a little bit more about how to organise these ideas into a helpful sequence.